You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 206. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Where in your life do you find yourself holding yourself back out of fear of criticism? Criticism is one of those thorny issues that can have a profound impact on the actions that you choose to take and not take. And I'm really excited to have you here this week so that we can dive into the topic of criticism, and I can offer you some strategies to help you next time you are at the receiving end of criticism, or next time you feel like you may be at the receiving end of criticism. Taking a step back, one of the reasons why I'm sharing this podcast episode with you this week is that lately I have been anticipating criticism from somebody in my personal life. And what I have found is that I keep replaying this imaginary conversation that I have not had. It's based on fragments of previous conversations that I've had with this person. And I find that my mind wanders at the most inopportune times to this anticipated meeting, the anticipated criticism. And what I realized is just how pernicious criticism can be, that even when I'm not facing actual words that have already been said, I'm preparing mentally for this thing that may or may not happen. And the example that I'm experiencing right now is one in my personal life, but I've also experienced it in my professional life, as have many of you, many of the lawyers that I've worked with, lawyers that I know socially. Criticism is kind of a thing. It's part of the job. It's also very likely part of your life outside of your work. So family members, friends, parents, people that you meet on the street, there is no shortage, I should say, of critics who are out there. And so today's episode is all about giving you some tools that I wish that I had had earlier to manage criticism better so that it has less of a hold over you, so that it doesn't prevent you from doing the things that you really want to do. I don't want criticism or the fear of criticism preventing you from playing big, from literally living your best life. So today we're going to talk about criticism and how to meet criticism with compassion, curiosity, and courage. These are strategies that you can use to manage criticism better so that you don't feel like you need to avoid it quite so much, or that you feel out of your element when you receive criticism, that you've got some tools to actually manage it. So to begin with, it might help to offer a definition of what criticism is. And we all innately know what criticism is. I'm sure each of us has examples of when we were criticized in our lives. We can probably also think of many times where we have criticized others. Now, the Oxford Languages Online Dictionary describes criticism as an expression of disapproval of someone or something based on perceived faults or mistakes. And this definition captures a number of ideas. Number one, this idea of disapproval, right? For all of us people pleasers who like everyone else to be happy with us, happy with their respective situations. When there is disapproval, there can be an uneasiness that we experience, especially if that disapproval is disapproval of us as people or something that we have done. Another aspect of criticism that is captured in this definition is the idea of perceived faults or mistakes. Critics are ultimately the ones who are offering the criticism, and just like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so too is criticism. And there's a wonderful article that is written in the Harvard Business Review magazine. It came out a number of years ago. I believe it's called The Feedback Fallacy. It's one of those articles that I've held on to and I share with everyone because it's got such great information in it. And one of the points made in this article is that feedback, including criticism, is very much something that is biased by the person who's giving the feedback. And in the article, the authors say that no amount of training can unlearn or take the bias out of the feedback provided by the person giving the feedback. So criticism is innate to the person giving it, and that makes a difference in terms of how we interpret criticism, how we experience criticism. As you've probably experienced, if criticism comes from somebody that you don't know very well, who maybe plays a very small role or no role in your actual life, it's a lot easier to let their words roll off your back relative to someone whose opinion really matters, whether it's a very close family member or somebody who you report to at work. Their criticism feels a lot more important, and chances are it has more of an impact on your day-to-day. And so that perception, their perception, the critic's perception is their perception, and the relative degree of impact that it has on you depends on the role that person plays in your life. And then finally, this idea that criticism is wrapped up with faults or mistakes. Typically, criticism means that you have done something wrong, and that really stings when we think about it in that way. So I'd encourage you to think about the role that criticism plays in your life. You might think about where criticism comes into play at work. If you have colleagues, for example, who are critical, sometimes that can happen. You may have a boss who is really critical, or clients who are critical, or opposing counsel who are critical. So there's lots of different personalities at work who may offer criticism to you. At home, you might find that there are people who are critics, whether they are family members. Sometimes parents can be really critical. Sometimes it's your children. The honesty of children is something we can all appreciate. Sometimes it means that they can be a little bit critical. Friends sometimes are critical. You might find that in some of your friendships, there's an element of criticism there that can be really difficult. That's in the scenario that I offered at the beginning. The conversation I'm anticipating is actually with a friend. That can be a little bit awkward. And sometimes it's just acquaintances, people that you don't know very well who offer criticism. And then, of course, there's that inner critic. That's a critic who's really hard to separate yourself from, because if that voice is internal, the criticism is being levied internally, then it can be really, really hard to escape that. And then another category of criticism that I thought of in preparing for today was this idea of almost like the invisible social critic. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think there are a lot of unwritten, unspoken, and sometimes spoken rules about how we should behave, who we should be as lawyers, as mothers, as friends, as humans. And so sometimes you might experience criticism, even though nobody actually utters words of criticism, you take it on as criticism. So an example for me would be if I walk into my house and I see a huge mess everywhere, I might take that on and say, well, I'm a very bad housekeeper. I should have things tidier than they are. Or if I visit at a friend's house and they've got all of their family pictures organized really beautifully on the walls, and I think, ooh, I should be a better homemaker. So it's that internal narrative, or it's that criticism that comes from accepting that a social norm is one that we should adhere to. And so if we haven't lived up to the standard that we've set or adopted, then we might be critical of ourselves. Now, the reason why criticism exists, well, I think humans just judge and criticize. It is what we do. And there are a number of reasons why we can do it. One of them is to correct mistakes. So if you think about the professional context where you've got a boss maybe who's reading over a contract that you drafted or something that you said in an email, and they're critical because what you've written maybe isn't correct, or the way that you said it isn't the way that they would say it, and they perceive that as being a mistake, or they perceive that as being a fault. So sometimes the reason that the criticism is being delivered is to correct or fix something. Sometimes criticism is delivered out of a protective instinct. So if you think of parents who are criticizing their children, if you think of your own parents, I know my parents were very critical of grades and getting good grades. And so your parents may have been the same way. And My guess is that the reason that they were so critical or are critical is because they're trying to protect you. They're trying to compel you to achieve at a certain level so that you can live a reasonably comfortable life. So sometimes there's an urge to protect. There may also be unconscious reasons why people are critical. So if you think about the person in the playground who is gossiping about the other kids on the playground, or in the work context, the person who is gossiping about other lawyers or about other people in the office, often that gossip stems from a desire to feel important and significant. It's maybe not the best way to attract attention, but being critical of other people helps them feel like they are somehow superior, that they are somehow more important. It can also be a defensive reaction. If you are, for example, feeling like somebody is maybe saying something that undermines your level of accomplishment or achievement, or you somehow find intimidating, you might be critical as a way of defending yourself. So if somebody, let's say it's a boss, and they are critical of your work, maybe they don't like the way that you drafted a certain clause in an agreement or the way that you worded part of an argument, then you might defend yourself by saying, well, that person is way too picky and they are never happy. And so it's a way of unconsciously taking the blame off of yourself. And one of the tricky things about criticism is that although it is everywhere and we all have experienced it, we're not necessarily trained in terms of how we can actually deal with criticism in a healthy way. So this podcast episode is really my attempt at sharing some tools that I wish that I had to help you next time you feel that sting of criticism, to have some constructive ways of processing it so that you're able to deal with it constructively and more confidently. So one other thing I'll mention here is that it's so fascinating to me that some people seem to be very good at dealing with criticism, whereas others are not. So you may notice that there are some people for whom criticism literally will roll off their back like like water off a duck's back. I know these people, it's like they've got this innate sense of confidence. They've got this way of hearing the criticism and they just don't let it bother them. Whereas for other people, even the slightest hint of criticism is something that they take very seriously and they have a really hard time letting it go. And you may have heard of rejection sensitive dysphoria. It is a trait that some people with ADHD have, and it's a characteristic where you are very sensitive to criticism. And so what that means is that you'll go well out of your way to avoid criticism. And when you do experience that criticism, it feels almost visceral. And so there's a whole range, a whole spectrum of ways that you can experience criticism. And my goal for you today, once again, is to have some ways of dealing with criticism so that you're not as fearful of receiving it, so that you feel more confident if you are at the receiving end of criticism. You've got a different way of looking at it. So there's a number of ways that you may currently deal with criticism. Some of them, some common ways of dealing with criticism. One is to criticize right back. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, you might have a boss who is really picky, who is picking apart every piece of writing, every email, every contract, everything you say, every interaction. And sometimes our instinct when we feel like we're being criticized is to simply criticize right back. Well, you are too picky. So that criticism has to be taken with a grain of salt. Another thing that we might do when we are criticized is try to defend ourselves. So not only is that person way too picky, but how on earth would you expect me to do a better job when I don't have the right support? I don't have the tools I need. It's the first time I've ever done this. My assistant has been away from the office sick for the last 3 weeks, and I've been doing all these other things. And so we might meet criticism with defense. And if you've read any of Byron Katie's work, she says that defense is the first act of war, which I find so interesting because I never would have thought of defense as being an act of war, but it is, right? You're now engaging. And if you're a litigator or former litigator, then you've probably had that experience of drafting pleadings, and it's very much that. There's that initiating pleading that sets out the claimant's arguments, and then the first thing that you do as a defendant is to defend. You're now engaging in an adversarial process. So when you defend against criticism, you are engaging in an adverse relationship. Other things that we might do when criticized: complain. And typically, when we complain, it's not complaining to the person who has criticized us. Usually it's going to somebody else and complaining about what it is that they said that they did. Typically, we will feel pretty badly. I know for myself, if I'm criticized and it's a meaningful criticism, I might feel badly about myself for some period of time. I might ruminate, think about that criticism I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. Criticism that hasn't even happened yet that I'm anticipating, where I'm ruminating about what that person might possibly say and how I'm going to respond to them. You might avoid risks that could create criticism or create more criticism. So if you know that there's a particular person that you could work with who has a tendency of being critical, you might avoid working with them. You might avoid conversations with them, and you might avoid taking on challenges, risks, opportunities that could have a really positive impact on you in your career, in your personal life. You play small in order to avoid criticism. And these strategies don't work as long-term solutions for growth or pursuing the things that you want to pursue. Avoiding, defending, criticizing offers some short-term relief. You can kind of burn off the negative emotions that come from the criticism, or you can avoid the criticism altogether, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem. And you don't learn the skill of actually dealing with the criticism and processing it. And what that can lead to then is this vicious cycle of criticism, some real, some in our minds, where we basically avoid and play small in order to avoid the criticism. And that can lead to this sense of greater fear of being criticized and this sense of powerlessness. We are now letting the fear of criticism dominate and dictate the choices that we make, the actions that we take and that we don't take. And this is something that you might really resonate with if you identify as a perfectionist. This idea that perfectionists are doing everything they can to do everything perfectly because they don't want to be at the receiving end of criticism. And taken too far, you can freeze yourself out of doing anything at all because you're so concerned about the criticism and judgment that might follow from you doing that thing, whether it's putting work into the world, whether it's submitting your memo to somebody else, whether it's filing your argument with the court, whether it's putting yourself on social media to attract new clients, whether it's speaking up at a meeting or speaking up at a larger, broader event, an industry event. So there may be lots of areas where you're talking yourself out of doing something because you're trying to avoid the criticism. So today's podcast episode is about using tools to help navigate criticism so that you can stop avoiding criticism and instead learn how to process it. So as I alluded to earlier, the ideas that we're going to discuss today are meeting criticism with compassion, curiosity, and courage. They all start with the letter C. I'm sure that there are more ways that you can meet criticism. These are the ones that we're talking about in this podcast episode. But let this be an invitation for you to think about other strategies that might be helpful for you, because ultimately, the best strategies are the ones that you actually apply in your practice, the ones that resonate the most with you. So I will offer what I have to share in this episode, but I would encourage you to think of this as the start of the conversation or an additional tool to have in your tool belt when it comes to criticism, and not the end or the final say. It's certainly not intended to be that. Going back to this idea of compassion, curiosity, and courage, the goal here is for you to have different ways of exploring criticism so that the criticism itself isn't holding you back. So, number one, compassion. If you are at the receiving end of criticism, what I would encourage you to do is, first of all, to step into the energy of compassion. And I would encourage you to do that from the perspective of the person who is the critic. Can we find compassion for the critic? And I would also invite you to find compassion for yourself. So starting with the critic, if you're trying to find compassion for that person, you might ask yourself how it makes sense for that person to criticize. If we think about the boss who's being critical of your work, you might put yourself in the shoes of your boss and think about what might be motivating them. And it might be a fear on their part of not measuring up. I think this is something that I know for myself. I never really thought of this when I was a junior lawyer. I just assumed all senior lawyers knew everything. They were omniscient and they would never have any concerns or fears about whether they were right or wrong, whether a case was strong or weak, how to engage with a client, because they came across as so confident. And yet, what I've now learned in my more senior years and having worked with a number of lawyers at all levels of seniority is that fear doesn't go away. There are still opportunities, there are still situations where even the most senior counsel are going to have moments where they do not feel 100% confident in what it is that they are doing. And so if they're being critical of you and your work, it may be that it stems from their own internal lack of confidence or doubt about the strength of a particular case, and that is being reflected on how they are speaking with you. So they may feel frustrated. I know as a parent, sometimes if I'm critical of my children, usually it's not because I want to be critical of them. Usually it's because it is way past my bedtime and I'm exhausted and I'm tired and it's the best that I can do in the moment. And so if you've got a colleague or a boss or a client who is really critical, it might simply be that they are frustrated, that there is something going on in their life that has nothing to do with you, and it is causing them to act a certain way with you. They are, in effect, taking it out on you, and it's not your fault. It's nothing that you have done wrong. And so it might just be something that is on them. It's affecting them, and it's coming out toward you. It may also be that the person that you are engaging with that is being critical or who is criticizing somebody else, they themselves do not feel accepted or valued. I mentioned the example of people who gossip. Often, if somebody is gossiping, it's because they themselves don't feel that confident in themselves. They don't feel valued. They feel small. And so gossiping is a way for them to feel important. It may also be that they are trying to be helpful, right? If you think about the example of parents wanting to protect you, wanting to help set you up for your strongest position, you might be able to find more compassion for them if instead of seeing them as the oppressive parents that are forcing you to get straight A's, they are actually concerned parents who are trying to help you the only way that they know how. And when you think of parents, when you think of bosses, when you think of yourself even, there are a number of us, I put myself in this category, particularly if you are of a certain generation, where criticism was considered to be one of the strongest and most effective ways of teaching somebody to do something, right? No pain, no gain. And so your boss or someone in your life may think that being critical is actually being helpful because that's how they were raised as lawyers, as humans. And so again, stepping into that compassionate place, can we look at the criticism from the critic's perspective and say or understand why it makes sense for that person to say the words they're saying, for them to feel the way that they do, again, through that compassionate lens. Now, I'd also encourage you to meet criticism with compassion for yourself. Sometimes I think we take that criticism on word for word and we layer shame on ourselves, we blame ourselves, we are in turn even more critical of ourselves. And instead of reaching for more, a bigger stick, you've probably heard the stick versus the carrot dichotomy, instead of reaching for a bigger stick and then whacking ourselves in the back and saying, well, not only did that person comment on the typo, what they didn't see was just how messy everything else was and how long it took me, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of layering on the criticism, what if we can be compassionate for ourselves? You might think about how it makes sense if, let's say, there was a typo in an email that you sent. Maybe you've been really busy. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep. Maybe you were under pressure to send the email in a hurry. You are, after all, only human. There are going to be typos in your work. So it may mean that you need to have a conversation with yourself that is compassionate. Maybe you are doing something for the first time and it doesn't go exactly the way that you wanted it to, but you want to give yourself credit for having tried in the first place, right? You took the risk. You have been courageous. And so I encourage you to find compassion, not only for the critic, but also compassion for yourself. Why does it make sense? I mean, this is taking almost at face value that the criticism is even valid. It may not be, but even if that criticism were valid, then how can you find compassion for yourself for that perceived flaw or mistake that is being pointed out to you? So that's number one, is when you are at the receiving end of criticism, to find compassion for yourself. Now, the second defense, if you will, or the second strategy is curiosity. And I think we can have a desire or an instinct to shut down when people are being critical of us. And again, going back to that article I mentioned, the one in the Harvard Business Review, and we'll link to it in the show notes that go with this episode. There's a really interesting part of that discussion, part of that article, where they talk about the body's physiological response to criticism. And what studies have found is that when you are criticized, your body goes into that sympathetic nervous response. It's that fight or flight, that stress response, where you become more focused on the immediate short-term survival, which means that you become less able to channel the more creative and longer-term thinking strategies. And so if you think about it from the perspective of criticism, and so you're just kind of almost trying to shield yourself in the moment. If you think about a difficult performance review, for example, or if you're being given harsh feedback by a boss, or your parent is telling you that, you haven't done it right, or some person is telling you haven't done it right, you might be so focused on survival that you don't feel really equipped to step into what I'm suggesting here, which is curiosity. And what I would encourage you to do, whether it is in the moment, let's say it's a performance review, whether you can have that conversation in the moment, or if it's something that maybe you need to revisit at a later date, curiosity can be really helpful, because what you can do then is use the criticism as an opportunity to learn more. So how do you apply curiosity? You might ask about what questions or what curious paths you might go down in terms of learning more about the criticism itself. You might ask about the person. The criticism will be a reflection of what's important to them, what their values are, how they think that work should be done, what they think is right in a particular situation. So criticism and unpacking that criticism, asking questions about it, will help you learn about that person. It can help you learn about the project. So if this is a work project and you are receiving criticism about the way that a contract was drafted, or an argument, or the way that you engaged with the client, you might ask questions to learn more about what that person's expectations are, what the critic expected, which will help set you up for greater success in future interactions that you have with that person. And it will also help you learn about yourself as you learn more about how this person perceived the work, perceived working with you. You might learn from their feedback how they perceive you. So maybe they say that you didn't pay enough attention to detail. And so that might be something that you investigate. Is it true, right? Are you finding that maybe you aren't paying as close attention to detail as you could, for example? And this leads to the second part of curiosity, asking about the criticism, asking questions, trying to figure out more data, and then also asking yourself if you can see the truth in the criticism. So what you might find is that when someone is critical of you and the criticism doesn't line up with any of your own internal, I'll call them insecurities for lack of a better word, but we all have areas where maybe we have weaknesses, or we think we have weaknesses. And if someone criticizes us and it lands on one of those weak spots, then we really feel it. It's almost like that feels very true, versus if someone criticizes us and we feel very confident in that area, we're a lot more likely to dismiss the criticism or take that criticism as an interesting data point, but not something that we're really going to ruminate over or feel too badly about. So when we receive criticism and it stings, that's a really good opportunity for us to explore more deeply what it was about the words that were said, maybe the person delivering the words, the manner in which it was said. What is it that it's striking at? What are we learning about ourselves when it comes to that particular criticism? And what might we do with that information? So for example, if it is attention to detail and somebody tells us, you just didn't pay close enough attention to detail, and we think back on dozens of times where we've received that very same feedback, and we realize that yes, we do have an issue when it comes to paying attention to detail, and maybe there are strategies that we can adopt and incorporate and practices that we can follow to get better at attention to detail. That might be an opportunity to learn more and to come up with some strategies to remedy the situation. So those are some of the questions that you might ask yourself in terms of curiosity. So again, going back to where we started, in the face of criticism, instead of being critical in response or getting defensive or trying to avoid it altogether, we can, first of all, fall into compassion. How can we find compassion for the critic and for ourselves? How can we be really curious about what is being said, curious about what we're learning about the other person, curious about the project itself, curious about ourselves, curious about the truth? Where do we see the truth, if there is any truth in the criticism? And then that brings us to the third element, which is courage. And what you may have noticed is that where there is criticism that brings up fear or doubt, chances are there is a courageous option that is available to you. Now, that might be a courageous conversation to have with the critic. If this is your boss and they're being critical of your work, you may want to have a further conversation with your boss in order to uncover any issues that are going on, any challenges that they've had working with you, any opportunities for you to maybe improve in their eyes. And it matters if they are your boss and you want to continue to work with that person. How can you go about doing that? Sometimes there might be a fear or a truth that you're required to face. Going back to that example of poor attention to detail, maybe that is something that you struggle with, and it's something that if you want to stay the course that you're on, you will need to get better at. And so it may require courageous action on your part. You may need to ask for help. You may need to seek out different strategies to improve your levels of attention to detail. Sometimes you might find that there's criticism, that there are relationships that aren't working out in your place of employment. You may have tried time and again to get along with somebody who's your boss or another lawyer in your department, and getting along with that person is essential for your success. And if you cannot do that, there might be the difficult either conversation with that person, trying to get on the same page as them, trying to win them over, trying to find a way to work together cooperatively and harmoniously, or it may be facing the truth that the writing is on the wall where you are, and that this is not going to be a fruitful opportunity for you in the long run. And so the difficult truth may be that this simply isn't the right place for you. And so that may require a courageous conversation. It might require a courageous move, a courageous decision in terms of what you want to do next. And one of the questions that you might ask yourself is, what would the most courageous version of yourself do in this situation? Given the criticism, given the situation, what would your most courageous self do? So those are the three approaches I'm offering in today's podcast episode to deal with criticism. Number one is to find compassion for the critic and for yourself, to approach the criticism with curiosity, and then finally to use courage as a way of exploring the criticism. What courageous conversation, what courageous decision, what courageous act would follow naturally on this criticism that you have received? Now, the reason why having a strategy is going to be more effective for you is that it will help you in the sense of you won't be so keen to avoid criticism, right? If you know that you can handle criticism, you'll be less fearful of it. You'll be more willing to put yourself in situations where you might receive criticism. And if and when you do receive criticism, instead of that being something that is almost like an assault to your senses, like here's a criticism and I'm just going to fight it or defend against it or resist it or avoid it, this gives you an opportunity to explore that criticism and to learn from it and to take positive steps based on that criticism. It will give you your power back, right? If you have been avoiding situations or avoiding people because of that fear of criticism, now you don't have to base your decisions on avoiding criticism. You get to base decisions on what's really motivating you. So you're getting your power back. You might feel a sense of relief. You no longer feel powerless in the face of criticism, or like you don't have any tools that you can use. And it also sets the stage for more productive next steps, whether it's that courageous conversation. Maybe you need to ask for help. Maybe you need to set some boundaries. Maybe you need to leave a difficult situation. Now, in order to use these strategies, you need a willingness to be open to exploring criticism. And you may not be at that point. Depending on the person who's giving the criticism, it may be simply that you're just not there yet, and that's okay. But it may also be that you are ready. You are willing to explore different ways of looking at the criticism, whether it's through that courageous lens, whether it's through curiosity, and even compassion. That you are willing to experiment and try something different. It means that you we'll likely need to let go of all or nothing thinking. So sometimes when we have a person who is critical of us, it can feel really good to put them in a box, a black and white box where we say, well, that person is unreasonable. And so, of course, they're going to be critical. And it's, in a way, mentally easier to do that, to have that black and white thinking. And what this approach requires, if you're going to especially step forward with that lens of compassion, is not to be thinking all in terms of black and white. You're actually looking at the situation from that person's point of view, and that is going to bring you into the shades of gray. So it means letting go of all or nothing thinking. And it also requires the skill of being courageous enough to have difficult conversations and to make difficult decisions. And the result at the end of all this is increased confidence in your ability to handle criticism, which brings us back to where we started. The reason why I think this is so important is because if criticism is holding you back from doing the things that you really want to do, I would love to change that for you. I would love to support you in helping you see past the criticism at the prize that is on the other side of that. The benefit to you of going after your goals, even if it means dealing with criticism along the way. It means more freedom for you to take on challenges and projects that might elicit criticism. So instead of playing small, instead of not putting out the reels, not putting your name out there, not raising your hand and volunteering, not taking on the project, not having the difficult conversation, instead of avoiding all those things where you fear criticism, you now feel like, okay, I can do these things. I may be criticized, and that's okay because I've got some tools to handle it. And as a result, you'll be taking more bold steps in a direction that feels good to you. And as your coach, that is absolutely what I want for you. So that's what I have to share with you today. So next time you are faced with criticism or you anticipate criticism, I'd love for you to go back to the 3 C's: compassion, curiosity, and courage. Think about this podcast episode and to give yourself the challenge, give yourself these tools to interpret the criticism, to rethink the criticism, and to manage the criticism in such a way that you are able to press forward, learn from it, move forward, and go after what it is that you want. So thank you so much for joining me here this week. It's been a pleasure to connect with you, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.